The midnight bell at Oxford University had long stopped tolling. Its echo dissolved into the crisp autumn air when Dr. Eleanor Walsh noticed something unusual. Most of the university's Gothic buildings stood in darkness, their medieval stones bathed in moonlight. But as she crossed the courtyard toward her car, a soft, persistent glow caught her attention from the corner of the cafeteria building. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. She wasn't meant to be there so late. As the head of the mathematics department, her day typically ended with afternoon lectures and evening office hours. But a particularly challenging research paper had kept her hunched over her desk until well past midnight, her eyes strained from equations that refused to align. She was exhausted, her mind foggy with numbers and theorems. All she wanted was to go home, pour a glass of wine, and collapse into bed. Yet that light, that stubborn, defiant light, pulled at her curiosity. Eleanor paused, keys dangling from her fingers. The practical side of her brain suggested it was likely just a janitor, or perhaps a forgetful student who'd left a lamp on. But something else, something deeper, urged her toward the cafeteria building. With a sigh that trailed into the cold night air, she changed course. The cafeteria stood silent and cavernous, its long tables empty of the usual chattering students. The floor gleamed dully under the emergency lights. Most of the room lay in half darkness, but at the far corner, a single overhead light illuminated a small area where the cafeteria met the kitchen entrance. As Eleanor approached, she realized someone was there. Not a janitor, but a young woman, bent over one of the tables, her hand moving rapidly across what looked like a stack of paper napkins. The girl was so absorbed in her task that she didn't notice Eleanor's approach. When Eleanor drew closer, she stopped, breath catching in her throat. The table was covered with equations, not just simple formulas, but complex mathematical expressions. Scratched onto napkins, paper placemats, even the cardboard sleeve of a coffee cup. Some were crossed out, others circled. Lines connecting various expressions in a web of logic that sprawled across the makeshift canvas. But what truly made Eleanor's heart skip was the nature of the equations themselves. She recognized elements of advanced calculus, number theory, and, most startlingly, a modified approach to a problem in quantum field theory that had stumped her own colleagues for years. The handwriting was messy, urgent, as if the ideas were pouring out faster than they could be captured. The young woman, barely 20, Eleanor guessed, wore a plain grey sweatshirt with the university's maintenance staff logo. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and a set of cleaning supplies sat abandoned on a nearby chair. She was clearly not a student. Eleanor watched as the girl frowned at a particular equation, crossed it out with 3 fierce strokes, then started again, muttering something under her breath. The concentration on her face was total, almost painful in its intensity. "Excuse me," Eleanor said softly, not wanting to startle her. The girl's head snapped up, eyes wide with alarm. In one fluid motion, she swept her arm across the table, gathering the napkins into a disorganized pile. "I'm sorry," she said, voice tight with panic. "I was just about to clean up. I didn't think anyone would be here. I wasn't slacking, I promise." No, Eleanor held up a hand. "I'm not here to check on you. I'm Dr. Walsh from mathematics." The girl went very still, clutching the napkins to her chest like a shield. "I know who you are," she said quietly. Eleanor gestured to the equations still visible on some of the napkins. "Did you write these?" The girl hesitated, then nodded once, a short, jerky movement. "May I?" Eleanor asked, pointing to the collection of notes. Another pause, longer this time. Then, reluctantly, the girl extended a few of the napkins. Eleanor took them carefully, as if handling ancient manuscripts. She studied the equations, her tired brain suddenly alert, humming with recognition and growing astonishment. "This approach to Calabi-Yau manifolds," she murmured, almost to herself. "It's not conventional, but it's elegant. And this sequencing here." She looked up sharply. "Where did you learn this?" The girl shrugged, eyes downcast. "Books, online lectures. I listen while I clean." "You taught yourself higher-level mathematics by listening to lectures while cleaning the university?" "Sometimes I stay after my shift to use the computers in the library," the girl admitted, then added hastily, "Only when they're not busy. No one minds." Eleanor felt something twist in her chest, admiration mixed with a peculiar sense of shame. On behalf of an institution that could overlook such talent walking its hallowed halls. "What's your name?" she asked. "Sophie," the girl replied. "Sophie Reeves." "How long have you worked here, Sophie?" "Almost 2 years. I started after..." She trailed off, then straightened her shoulders. "I needed the job." Eleanor nodded, sensing there was more to the story but not wanting to push. "And how long have you been working on these equations?" Sophie's expression softened slightly, the defensiveness giving way to something else, a quiet passion that transformed her face. "Always, I guess. Numbers make sense to me. They're..." She searched for the right word. "They're honest." Eleanor looked down at the napkins again, at the brilliant calculations scrawled in ballpoint pen on cheap paper. In her 30 years at Oxford, she had taught some of the brightest mathematical minds in the country. None of them had shown this kind of raw, untrained intuition. "Sophie," she said carefully, "do you know what you've done here?" She held up a napkin with a particularly complex series of expressions. "This is a novel approach to a problem many established mathematicians have struggled with." Sophie blinked, surprised. "Really? I thought it was just a standard application of..." "No," Eleanor interrupted. "It's not standard at all. It's quite brilliant, actually." The word hung in the air between them. Brilliant, not a word Eleanor used lightly. Sophie's cheeks flushed and she looked away, clearly uncomfortable with the praise. "I should finish my cleaning," she said, reaching for the mop propped against a nearby table. "My supervisor checks." Eleanor wanted to say more, to ask how someone with such obvious mathematical talent had ended up mopping floors instead of studying in a classroom. But she could see the walls going up in Sophie's posture, in the way she gripped the mop handle, like an anchor. "Of course," Eleanor said instead, "but Sophie..." The girl looked up. "Would it be all right if I kept these?" Eleanor asked, indicating the napkins with the equations. "I'd like to study them more carefully." Sophie hesitated, then gave a small nod. "They're just napkins," she said. But her eyes told a different story. They were more than napkins to her. They were windows into a world she could glimpse but couldn't enter. "Thank you," Eleanor said, tucking the napkins carefully into her bag. "And Sophie, would you be willing to meet me tomorrow? During your break, perhaps?" Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "I'd like to talk more about your work." Sophie seemed to consider this, suspicion warring with a flicker of hope in her expression. Finally, she nodded. "I have a break at 3, in the staff room." "I'll be there," Eleanor promised. As she walked back to her car, the napkins safely stored in her bag, Eleanor felt a strange mixture of excitement and unease. In all her years at Oxford, with its legacy of brilliant minds and world-changing discoveries, she had never expected to find such raw mathematical talent hiding in plain sight, working the night shift with a mop and bucket. The image of Sophie's intense focus as she worked through those equations stayed with Eleanor during her drive home. The girl didn't just understand mathematics, she communed with it, wrestled with it, approached it with a fearlessness that most trained mathematicians lost somewhere along the way. By the time Eleanor arrived home, exhaustion had been replaced by determination. She spread the napkins across her dining room table and stayed up until dawn, studying Sophie's work, marveling at the intuitive leaps, the creative approaches to problems that had stumped far more educated minds. Something had to be done. Sophie Reeves didn't belong in the shadows, cleaning up after others. She belonged in the light, adding her unique voice to the ancient conversation of numbers and symbols that had shaped human understanding for centuries. But as the first rays of sun crept through her window, Eleanor knew it wouldn't be simple. Oxford, for all its ideals of meritocracy and intellectual pursuit, was still an institution bound by traditions, by systems that could be as rigid as they were venerable. Bringing Sophie from the margins to the center would require more than recognition of her talent. It would require changing the very structures that had overlooked her in the first place. Eleanor gathered the napkins, handling them with the reverence usually reserved for rare manuscripts. Whatever barriers stood in Sophie's way, financial, social, institutional, Eleanor Walsh was now determined to help dismantle them one by one. Because sometimes the greatest minds weren't found in lecture halls or research laboratories. Sometimes they were found in the quiet corners of university cafeterias, working with napkins and borrowed pens, their brilliance a secret they kept to themselves. The following afternoon, Eleanor arrived at the staff room precisely at 3 o'clock. The space was small and utilitarian, a stark contrast to the oak-paneled faculty lounges she was accustomed to. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a harsh glow on the mismatched furniture and the small refrigerator covered in notices about cleaning rotors and lost property. Sophie was already there, sitting rigid at a folding table, hands wrapped around a chipped mug of tea. She had changed into her street clothes, faded jeans and a plain blue sweater that had seen better days. Her dark hair was pulled back as it had been the night before, but in daylight, Eleanor could see the shadows under her eyes, the tension in her jaw. This was not someone who took meetings with professors lightly. "Thank you for coming," Eleanor said, taking the seat across from her. Sophie gave a tight nod. "Did you want to talk about my cleaning? Because if there was a problem—" "No," Eleanor interrupted gently. "I wanted to talk about your mathematics." She placed a leather portfolio on the table and opened it to reveal Sophie's equations, now carefully preserved. Next to them, she had printed out pages of her own notes and calculations, expanding on Sophie's work, testing its boundaries. "I spent most of the night going through these," Eleanor explained, watching Sophie's expression carefully. "What you've done here is remarkable, Sophie, truly remarkable." Sophie stared at the portfolio, something flickering in her eyes. Recognition, perhaps, or surprise at seeing her scribbled thoughts presented so formally. "They're just ideas," she said softly. "Probably nothing new." Eleanor shook her head. "On the contrary, this approach to quantum field regularization," she pointed to a particularly dense set of calculations, "is not just new, it's potentially groundbreaking." Sophie's eyes widened slightly, and Eleanor caught a glimpse of something behind the carefully maintained wall, a flash of pride, quickly suppressed. "May I ask you something, Sophie?" Eleanor ventured. "How did you come to work at Oxford?" Sophie's shoulders tensed, and for a moment Eleanor thought she might refuse to answer. Then she sighed, a soft exhale that seemed to carry the weight of too many disappointments. "I was supposed to be a student," she said, her voice matter-of-fact. "I had a scholarship to study mathematics at King's College London. Full ride." Eleanor nodded, encouraging her to continue. "Then my dad got sick. Cancer," Sophie continued, her tone deliberately flat. My mum had left years ago, and my little brother was still in school. Someone had to take care of them. I deferred for a year, but 1 year turned into 2, and then the scholarship was gone. She shrugged, a small defensive gesture. We needed money. Oxford pays better than most places for maintenance staff, and they offer night shifts, which means I can be home during the day when Dad needs me. It's fine, but it wasn't fine. Eleanor could see that clearly in the way Sophie's fingers tightened around her mug. In the careful way she avoided looking directly at the equations, her equations, spread out on the table. And the mathematics? Eleanor asked softly. When? Do you find time for that? A ghost of a smile crossed Sophie's face. Whenever I can. Late nights, mostly. The cafeteria is quiet after hours, and no one minds if I use the tables once they're cleaned. Sometimes I listen to online lectures while I work. MIT puts their courses online for free. Eleanor felt a surge of admiration mixed with a deep sense of injustice. Here was a young woman with extraordinary talent, working night shifts, cleaning floors, snatching moments to pursue complex mathematical theories in the margins of her exhausting life. Sophie, Eleanor said, choosing her words carefully, I believe you have a rare gift. The kind of mathematical intuition I see in your work typically takes years of formal training to develop, if it develops at all. You've arrived at solutions through pure insight that others reach only through years of structured study. Sophie looked uncomfortable with the praise, shifting in her seat. What are you saying exactly? Eleanor leaned forward. I'm saying that talent like yours shouldn't be mopping floors. It should be nurtured, developed, challenged. Right, Sophie said, a hint of bitterness creeping into her voice. I'll just quit my job, abandon my family, and magically find the money for university, shall I? No, Eleanor replied calmly. That's not what I'm suggesting at all. She reached into her bag and pulled out a folder with the Oxford crest embossed on the cover. The university has a number of special admission programs for exceptional cases. Most are never used because, frankly, truly exceptional cases are rare. Sophie eyed the folder warily. What does that mean? It means there might be a way for you to study here, formally, with financial support and flexibility to accommodate your family situation. The words hung in the air between them. Sophie stared at Eleanor, her expression a complex mixture of hope, suspicion, and something that looked almost like fear. Why would you do this? She asked finally. You don't even know me. Eleanor considered the question, wanting to give an honest answer. Because mathematics needs voices like yours, she said simply. Because I've spent 30 years teaching students who come from privilege, who've had every advantage, and while many of them are bright, few have the kind of innate understanding I see in your work. She tapped one of the napkins. This isn't just solving equations, Sophie. This is seeing patterns, connections, possibilities that others miss. It's too valuable to remain hidden on cafeteria napkins. Sophie was silent for a long moment, her eyes fixed on the folder with the Oxford crest. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. I can't leave my family. You won't have to, Eleanor assured her. We can work around your needs, part-time study initially, perhaps, with some remote options. The details can be sorted. Sophie looked up, her eyes suddenly fierce. I don't want charity. This isn't charity, Eleanor said firmly. This is recognizing talent and making sure it has the chance to develop. It's what universities are supposed to do, though we often fall short. She pushed the folder gently across the table. Just think about it. That's all I'm asking for now. Sophie hesitated, then slowly reached for the folder, her fingers brushing against the embossed crest as if testing whether it was real. My shift ends at 11 tonight, she said quietly. Eleanor nodded, understanding the unspoken message. Sophie needed time to process this unexpected turn, to consider possibilities. She had likely forced herself to stop imagining long ago. "I'll be in my office until late," Eleanor said, rising from her chair. "If you want to talk more." As she turned to leave, Sophie's voice stopped her. "Dr. Walsh?" Eleanor looked back. "Thank you," Sophie said, the words clearly difficult. "For her. For seeing me." The simple statement hit Eleanor with unexpected force. For seeing me. Not just for noticing her mathematical ability, but for seeing her, a whole person with value beyond what she could produce or contribute. "Thank you for letting me," Eleanor replied softly. Then she left, giving Sophie the space she needed to absorb what had just happened, to consider a future suddenly filled with new possibilities. Walking back to her office, Eleanor felt a renewed sense of purpose. In her 3 decades at Oxford, she had published dozens of papers, mentored countless students, and received her share of accolades from the mathematical community. But none of that compared to the potential impact of this, of helping to bring a singular talent like Sophie's into the light. The challenges ahead would be considerable. There would be paperwork, exceptions to be approved, rigidity to be overcome. Sophie herself might resist. Pride and practical concerns, wrestling with opportunity. The path forward wouldn't be straight or simple. But as Eleanor settled back at her desk, the memory of those equations scrawled on napkins still fresh in her mind, she knew it would be worth it. Because sometimes the most brilliant lights were those that burned quietly in the corners, awaiting only a chance to shine. That evening, as the ancient bells of Oxford chimed 10 o'clock, Eleanor remained in her office, ostensibly reviewing student assignments, but actually watching the clock with growing unease. Would Sophie come? Or had the offer been too sudden, too overwhelming? The hallway outside her office was silent, the building nearly empty. Most of her colleagues had long since gone home to families or pubs or the comfortable isolation of academic apartments. Only the security guard made occasional rounds, nodding respectfully as he passed her open door. At 10:47, footsteps echoed on the polished floor outside. Hesitant at first, then more determined, Eleanor looked up as Sophie appeared in her doorway, still in her work uniform, the folder clutched tightly in one hand. "May I come in?" she asked, voice steady despite the uncertainty in her eyes. "Of course," Eleanor said, gesturing to the chair across from her desk. Sophie entered but remained standing, her posture tense. She looked around the office, taking in the bookshelves stuffed with mathematical texts, the awards framed on the walls, the stacks of papers covering nearly every surface. "I've been thinking about your offer," she said finally. Eleanor waited, giving her space to continue. "I think I studied this paper last month," Sophie said unexpectedly, pointing to a journal open on Eleanor's desk. "Weinstein's approach to symplectic geometry. I found it online." Eleanor blinked in surprise. "That was just published in the International Journal of Mathematics. It's quite advanced." Sophie shrugged. "It made sense to me, mostly." She paused, then added, "I think there's an error in the third proof, though. On page 17, the boundary conditions don't hold under transformation." Eleanor stared at her, then quickly flipped to page 17 of the journal. She read through the proof carefully, her mind racing as she followed the complex logic. After a moment, she looked up, astonished. "You're right," she said. "It's subtle, but it's definitely there." She shook her head in wonder. "Most peer reviewers missed this." A small, proud smile flickered across Sophie's face, there and gone in an instant. She took a deep breath, straightening her shoulders. "I want to study mathematics," she said, each word deliberate. "I've always wanted that. But I need to keep working, and I need flexibility for my family." Eleanor nodded. "We can arrange that." And I don't want special treatment in the classroom, Sophie added firmly. If I do this, I want to earn my place, just like anyone else. You'll have the same academic expectations as any student, Eleanor assured her, though I suspect you'll exceed most of them. Sophie was quiet for a moment, wrestling with something internal. Then she said, "My dad doesn't know how much I love mathematics. I never told him. I didn't want him to feel guilty about my scholarship." The admission hung in the air, heavy with unspoken pain and sacrifice. "Perhaps it's time he knew," Eleanor suggested gently. Sophie nodded, her eyes suddenly bright with unshed tears. "Perhaps it is." She placed the folder carefully on Eleanor's desk and opened it, revealing the application forms inside, already filled out in neat, precise handwriting. "I'll need help with some of these," she said, pointing to sections requesting academic references and transcripts. "It's been a while since I was a student." "I'll help you," Eleanor promised, "every step of the way." Sophie looked up, her expression a complex mixture of hope, determination, and lingering disbelief, as if she were standing at the edge of something both wonderful and terrifying. "Why me?" she asked suddenly. "Out of all the people you could help, why me?" Eleanor considered the question carefully. The easy answer would be to cite Sophie's obvious mathematical talent, the brilliant work on those napkins. But there was more to it than that, because talent without opportunity is one of the greatest wastes in our world, she said finally, and because 30 years ago someone took a chance on me when I was struggling, not in the same way you are, but enough that I understand what it means to be seen when you've been invisible. Sophie nodded slowly, absorbing this. Then she extended her hand across the desk, a simple, dignified gesture. "Thank you, Dr. Walsh," she said, her voice steady. "I won't let you down." Eleanor took her hand, feeling the calluses from years of physical labor, the strength in her grip. "I know you won't," she replied. "But remember, Sophie, this isn't about proving yourself to me or to Oxford. It's about claiming the education that should have been yours all along." As their hands separated, something shifted in the air between them, from professor and cleaner to colleagues, to two women united by a shared love of the abstract beauty of mathematics and the concrete reality of creating change. Outside the window, Oxford's spires stood silhouetted against the night sky, ancient and imposing. For centuries, those buildings had represented both knowledge and exclusion, brilliance and privilege. But tonight, in a small office cluttered with papers, a subtle rebellion had begun. Because sometimes the greatest minds weren't found through the traditional pathways of privilege and preparation. Sometimes they were found scribbling equations on cafeteria napkins in the midnight hours, their brilliance waiting only for someone willing to look in unexpected places. And sometimes all it took was one person to notice, one person to say, "I see you. You belong here. Your light matters." The autumn term at Oxford began with its usual pageantry. New students in freshly pressed clothes navigated the labyrinthine campus with nervous excitement, while returning students greeted each other with comfortable familiarity. The ancient quads echoed with voices and footsteps, a symphony of privilege and potential that had played out for centuries. Dr. Eleanor Walsh watched it all from the window of her office, fingers tapping thoughtfully against her coffee mug. The familiar rhythm of academic life continued around her, but her mind was elsewhere, focused on a young woman who should have been among those bright-eyed students, but instead wore a grey maintenance uniform and carried cleaning supplies instead of textbooks. A knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. "Come in," she called, turning from the window. Professor Richard Harlow entered, a thick folder tucked under his arm. As head of admissions for the mathematics department, his support was crucial for what Eleanor had in mind. "You wanted to see me about an unusual application?" he asked, taking the seat across from her desk. Eleanor nodded, gesturing to the folder he carried. "Thank you for coming, Richard. I know how busy the start of term can be." Richard smiled thinly, particularly when one receives an urgent request to consider a special admission case after all placements have been finalized. He placed the folder on her desk. "I reviewed the materials you sent. It's unusual, to say the least." Eleanor leaned forward. "But you see the potential." It wasn't a question. Anyone with a mathematical background who reviewed Sophie's work would recognize the exceptional talent it represented. Richard sighed, removing his glasses to polish them methodically. "The work is impressive, yes, particularly given the circumstances." He replaced his glasses, expression serious. "But, Eleanor, surely you understand the complications. No formal education beyond secondary school, no A-levels, no foundation year, and you're proposing we admit her directly to a mathematics degree at Oxford?" "I'm proposing we recognize extraordinary talent when we see it," Eleanor replied. "Isn't that what Oxford claims to value above all else?" Richard's expression tightened. "We value talent within a framework of academic preparation and proven capacity for rigorous study. This young woman, however gifted, has none of that. She has been studying independently for years," Eleanor countered, "and her work demonstrates an intuitive grasp of concepts that many of our postgraduates struggle with." "Written on napkins," Richard said dryly. Eleanor felt a flash of irritation. "Newton wrote on the walls of his rooms. Ramanujan used slate because he couldn't afford paper. Are their contributions less valuable because of the medium?" Richard held up a conciliatory hand. "I'm not dismissing her work, Eleanor. I'm simply pointing out the practical challenges. Even if we were to admit her, which would require extraordinary exceptions to our policies, how would she cope with the structured curriculum? The examinations? The tutorials?" It was a fair question, one that Eleanor had been grappling with herself. "We start small," she said. "Part-time study initially, a customized program that allows her to demonstrate mastery at her own pace. She'll continue working. She's made it clear that supporting her family is non-negotiable, but we can arrange flexible attendance." Richard looked skeptical. "And who would oversee this customized program? Who would provide the additional support she'd undoubtedly need?" "I would," Eleanor said simply. A moment of silence followed her declaration. Richard studied her, curiosity replacing his initial resistance. "May I ask why you're so invested in this particular case?" he asked finally. "You've never shown such interest in our admissions policies before." Eleanor considered her answer carefully. "Do you remember Goran Petrovic?" Richard frowned slightly. "The Serbian mathematician. Brilliant work on prime number theory." "He was a janitor," Eleanor said quietly. "For 15 years he cleaned buildings at the University of Belgrade while teaching himself mathematics from discarded textbooks. By the time someone recognized his talent, he was nearly 40. Think of what might have been if he'd been discovered earlier." She tapped the folder containing Sophie's application. "Sophie Reeves is 23. She has already demonstrated extraordinary mathematical intuition. I refuse to let another brilliant mind be lost because they didn't arrive through the traditional channels." Richard was silent for a long moment, weighing her words. Finally, he sighed, a sound of reluctant capitulation. "There will need to be an assessment," he said, "formal and rigorous. If she truly has the talent you claim, she should be able to demonstrate it under standard examination conditions." "Of course," Eleanor agreed readily, "and the exceptions committee will need to approve this. I can't make this decision unilaterally." "I understand." "And Eleanor," Richard added, his voice softening slightly, "she may fail, not for lack of brilliance, but because formal education requires more than raw talent. Structure, discipline, the ability to work within established frameworks, these are equally important. Eleanor nodded, acknowledging the validity of his concern. All I'm asking is that we give her the chance to try. Richard gathered his papers, expression thoughtful. I'll present the case to the committee next week. I make no promises about the outcome. Thank you, Eleanor said, meaning it. Richard could have dismissed the idea outright. Many in his position would have. After he left, Eleanor sat quietly, turning over the conversation in her mind. Richard wasn't wrong about the challenges ahead. Oxford's academic environment was demanding under the best circumstances. For someone like Sophie, with no formal higher education and significant personal responsibilities, the path would be even more difficult. But difficulty wasn't impossibility, and sometimes the most important thing was simply opening the door, creating the possibility where none had existed before. Eleanor picked up her phone and dialed the facilities management office. "This is Dr. Walsh," she said when the receptionist answered. "I'd like to leave a message for Sophie Reeves. Could you ask her to stop by my office when her shift begins this evening?" The conversation with Sophie would be delicate. Eleanor needed to prepare her for the assessment without overwhelming her, to offer support without undermining her independence. It was a careful balance, one that required respecting Sophie both as a brilliant mathematician and as a person who had been making her own difficult choices for years. As she gathered materials for their meeting, Eleanor reflected on the strange turn her academic career had taken. After decades of research papers and lecture halls, she found herself fighting administrative battles for a cleaner who solved complex equations on cafeteria napkins. It wasn't what she had envisioned for her final years at Oxford, but it felt more meaningful than anything she had done in a long time. The campus grew quieter as afternoon faded into evening. Students retreated to libraries or college bars, while faculty members headed home or to formal dinners. The ancient buildings settled into their nightly hush, broken only by the occasional burst of laughter or music from student accommodations. At precisely 7 o'clock, a soft knock sounded at Eleanor's door. Sophie stood in the hallway, still in her street clothes, a small backpack slung over one shoulder. She looked tired, the kind of bone-deep exhaustion that came from juggling. Too many responsibilities with too few resources, but her eyes were clear and alert as she entered the office. "You wanted to see me, Dr. Walsh." Eleanor gestured to the chair across from her desk. "Yes, thank you for coming. How are you, Sophie?" Sophie sat, placing her backpack carefully at her feet. "Fine," she said, the automatic response of someone unaccustomed to being asked. Then, after a moment, she added more honestly, "Tired. Dad had a rough night, and I picked up an extra shift to cover for a colleague." Eleanor nodded, concern flickering across her face. "Is your father doing any better?" "Some days," Sophie said with a small shrug. "The new medication helps with the pain, at least." She straightened in her chair, clearly uncomfortable with discussing personal matters. "You said you had news about my application." Eleanor recognized the deflection, but didn't push. "Yes," she said, leaning forward slightly. "I've spoken with the head of admissions for the mathematics department. He's agreed to present your case to the exceptions committee next week." Sophie's eyes widened. "Really? That's good, right?" "It's a step forward," Eleanor said carefully, "but there's a condition. They want you to take a formal assessment to demonstrate your mathematical abilities." Sophie's expression tightened. "Like an exam?" "No, similar, yes. It would cover several areas of mathematics: calculus, linear algebra, number theory, basic topology." Sophie was quiet for a moment, her fingers fidgeting with the cuff of her sweater. "When?" "Next Friday," Eleanor said. "That gives us just over a week to prepare." "Us? If you'd like my help?" Eleanor clarified quickly. I thought I could guide you through some practice problems, help you understand the format. Oxford examinations have their own peculiarities. Sophie seemed to wrestle with this offer, pride warring with practicality. Finally, practicality won out. I would appreciate that, she said, but I don't know when I could fit it in. I'm working double shifts this week, and when I'm home, I need to be with Dad. Eleanor nodded, having anticipated this difficulty. We could meet late evenings after your shift, or early mornings if that's better, and I could provide materials for you to review during any breaks you might have. Sophie considered this, her eyes drifting to the bookshelves lining Eleanor's office, filled with advanced mathematical texts. There was hunger in that gaze, not the desperate kind that came from physical need, but the deeper yearning of a mind starved for knowledge, for challenge, for recognition. Do you really think I could pass this assessment? She asked quietly. Be honest with me, please. Eleanor met her gaze directly. Based on the work I've seen, yes, the concepts will be familiar to you, even if the formal presentation isn't. The challenge will be adapting to the structured format and managing the time pressure. Sophie nodded slowly, absorbing this. I should tell you, she said after a moment, I've never been good at formal exams. Even in school, I get anxious. My mind races too fast, jumps ahead of the questions. Teachers always thought I wasn't paying attention. It was a vulnerability that clearly cost her to admit. Eleanor valued the trust it represented. We can work on that, she said. There are techniques that can help. And remember, Sophie, this isn't a standard entrance exam. The committee will be looking at your unique approach, your intuitive understanding. That's what makes your work special. Sophie didn't look entirely convinced, but she nodded again, more decisively this time. Okay, when do we start? Eleanor smiled, relieved. How about now? I've prepared some preliminary materials. She opened a drawer and pulled out a neatly organized folder containing practice problems, summary sheets of key theorems, and sample examination questions from previous years. Sophie accepted the folder, her fingers tracing the Oxford crest embossed on its cover. For a moment, she looked almost young, a glimpse of the student she might have been if life had taken a different turn. Thank you, she said softly, for believing in me. Not many people have. Eleanor felt a tightness in her chest. They should have, she said simply. For the next 2 hours, they worked together at Eleanor's desk, going through fundamental concepts and examination strategies. Sophie's mind was, as Eleanor had suspected, extraordinarily agile, grasping complex ideas quickly, seeing connections that many would miss. But there were also gaps in her knowledge, areas where her self-directed study had skipped over foundational principles in favor of more interesting advanced concepts. It's like you built a beautiful house without some of the supporting beams, Eleanor observed as they reviewed a particularly challenging problem. The structure stands because of your intuitive understanding of weight distribution, but eventually, those missing supports will matter. Sophie frowned, erasing a line of calculation with more force than necessary. I didn't have anyone to tell me what order to learn things in, she said, a defensive edge to her voice. I just followed what interested me. That's not a criticism, Eleanor assured her gently. In fact, it's quite remarkable what you've accomplished without formal guidance. We just need to fill in some of those gaps before the assessment. Sophie nodded, shoulders relaxing slightly. Show me what I'm missing. They continued working until the ancient clock tower chimed 9 times, its deep tones reverberating through the stone walls of the building. Sophie started, glancing at her watch. I need to go, she said, hastily gathering her papers. My shift starts at 10, and I need to check on Dad first. Eleanor nodded, helping her organize the materials into the folder. Take these with you. Review them when you can. We can meet again tomorrow evening if that works for you. Sophie hesitated, clutching the folder. "Professor Walsh, what happens if I don't pass this assessment? If the committee says no?" It was the question Eleanor had been dreading, not because she didn't have an answer, but because the answer wasn't the one either of them wanted. "Then we look for other pathways," she said carefully. "There are alternative routes to education, distance learning programs, open university courses, places where your talent could still be nurtured, even if not at Oxford." Sophie absorbed this, her expression unreadable. Then she straightened her shoulders, a gesture Eleanor was coming to recognize as her way of facing difficult truths. "I should go," she said again. "Thank you for tonight." Eleanor walked her to the door. "Sophie," she said as the young woman stepped into the hallway, "whatever happens with the assessment with the committee, what you have is real. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise." Sophie gave a small nod, then turned and walked away, her footsteps echoing in the empty corridor. Eleanor watched until she disappeared around the corner, then returned to her desk, mind already turning to the days ahead. She had a week to prepare Sophie for an examination that would determine not just her academic future, but potentially the trajectory of her entire life. The stakes were impossibly high, the timeline brutally short. But as she reviewed her notes, from their session, Eleanor felt a growing certainty that they could succeed. Sophie's raw talent was undeniable. With the right preparation, with enough belief in her own abilities, she could demonstrate that talent in a way even the most traditional academics couldn't ignore. And perhaps, just perhaps, Oxford would prove itself worthy of the brilliant mind it had been unknowingly housing in its shadows all this time. The following days fell into a pattern. Sophie would finish her cleaning shift near midnight, then meet Eleanor in her office for 2 hours of intensive preparation. They worked methodically through practice problems, mock examination questions, and theoretical concepts that Sophie had missed in her self-directed studies. Despite her exhaustion, working full days, caring for her father, studying late into the night, Sophie never complained. She arrived at each session with questions prepared, problems she'd been working on during brief breaks or while riding the bus home. Her dedication was humbling, her capacity for absorbing new information remarkable. By Wednesday night, Eleanor was cautiously optimistic. Sophie was making rapid progress, filling the gaps in her knowledge while maintaining the creative approach that made her work special. But as their session wound down, Eleanor noticed Sophie seemed distracted, her usual laser focus wavering. "Is everything all right?" she asked, as Sophie stared blankly at a problem she should have solved easily. Sophie looked up, shadows under her eyes more pronounced than usual. "My dad's doctor called today," she said after a moment. "The cancer's spreading. They want to try a new treatment, but our insurance won't cover all of it." Eleanor's heart sank. "I'm so sorry, Sophie. That's awful news." Sophie shrugged, a gesture that tried for nonchalance but fell painfully short. "It is what it is. We'll figure something out. We always do." She turned back to the problem, pencil moving mechanically across the page. But Eleanor could see her mind was elsewhere, trapped in calculations far more immediate and painful than abstract mathematics. "Sophie," she said gently, "we can stop for tonight. This can wait." "No," Sophie said sharply. Then, softer, "No, this is important too. This is the future. I need to focus on that right now." Eleanor understood. Sometimes when the present became unbearable, the future was the only place left to find hope. "All right," she agreed. "Let's continue. But promise me, you'll get some rest tonight." Sophie gave a tired smile. "I'll try." They worked for another hour, Sophie gradually regaining her focus, her natural mathematical instincts reasserting themselves. As they were wrapping up, Eleanor hesitated, then reached for her bag. "I have something for you," she said, pulling out a small wrapped package. "Just a small token for good luck." Sophie looked surprised, accepting the package cautiously. She unwrapped it slowly, revealing a beautiful fountain pen, sleek and professional, with a small mathematical symbol, infinity, engraved on its side. "For your calculations," Eleanor explained, "every mathematician should have a proper instrument." Sophie stared at the pen, fingers tracing the infinity symbol. For a moment, Eleanor feared she had overstepped, that the gift might be seen as charity rather than the gesture of support it was intended to be. Then Sophie looked up, eyes bright with emotion. "Thank you," she said simply, but the words carried the weight of much more than gratitude for a pen. Eleanor nodded, understanding what wasn't said. "You're welcome." The night before the assessment, their final preparation session ran later than usual. The examination would take place at 9 the following morning. A 3-hour test covering multiple areas of mathematics, designed to evaluate not just Sophie's knowledge but her capacity for rigorous academic study. "Remember," Eleanor said as they reviewed the last set of practice problems, "pace yourself, read each question carefully, and if you get stuck, move on and come back later." Sophie nodded, though her hands betrayed her nervousness. Fidgeting with the fountain pen Eleanor had given her. "What if my mind goes blank? Sometimes under pressure I just freeze." "Take a deep breath," Eleanor advised. "Close your eyes for a moment if you need to. Remember that you know this material. You've been doing mathematics all your life, Sophie. Tomorrow is just another opportunity to show what you already know." Sophie attempted a smile, but it faltered. "I'm not just nervous about the exam," she admitted quietly. "It's everything that comes after. If I pass, if they actually admit me, how will I manage? The tuition, the time commitment, Dad's care, my job." "One step at a time," Eleanor said gently. "Let's focus on tomorrow's assessment. When you succeed, we'll tackle the next challenges together." Sophie looked up, vulnerability clear in her expression. "Why are you doing all this for me?" It was a question Eleanor had asked herself many times over the past weeks. The answer was complex, layered with personal history, professional ideals, and something more fundamental, a recognition of both injustice and possibility. "Because talent should be nurtured wherever it's found," she said simply. "Because mathematics needs voices like yours, and because sometimes the most important thing one person can do for another is to say, 'I see you, I believe in you, I will stand beside you while you find your path.'" Sophie held her gaze for a long moment, then nodded once, a gesture of acceptance and understanding that needed no words. They parted shortly after midnight, Sophie heading home for a few hours of rest before the most important examination of her life. Eleanor remained in her office, too keyed up to sleep. She tidied her desk, organized her notes, and tried not to think about all the ways tomorrow could go wrong. The truth was, Eleanor had spent her career within the safe confines of academic tradition. She had navigated the system successfully, earned its rewards, and upheld its standards. But she had never truly challenged its foundations, never questioned who it excluded or what talent it might be missing. Until she had seen equations that should have been written on departmental blackboards, scrawled instead on cafeteria napkins by someone who cleaned floors instead of attending lectures. Whatever happened tomorrow, Eleanor knew her own perspective had been permanently altered. She could never again look at her students, her department, her university in quite the same way. She would always wonder who else might be out there. Brilliant minds laboring in obscurity, waiting for someone to simply look in their direction and see the light burning there. Morning arrived with a pale October sun struggling through clouds. The Oxford campus stirred to life, students and faculty, emerging from ancient buildings and modern apartments, gathering in courtyards and coffee shops, classrooms and libraries. In a small examination room in the mathematics building, Sophie Reeves sat alone at a desk, staring at the sealed test paper before her. She wore her best clothes, clean jeans and a simple blue blouse she had ironed carefully that morning. Her dark hair was pulled back neatly, and Eleanor's fountain pen lay beside her answer booklet. Outside the room, Eleanor paced the corridor, forbidden from entering once the assessment had begun. Professor Richard Harlow stood nearby, watching her, with a mixture of amusement and concern. "You're more nervous than most parents on interview day," he observed dryly. Eleanor shot him a look. "This isn't just another applicant, Richard. This is someone who's had to overcome more obstacles than most of our students can imagine." Richard's expression softened slightly. "I know, and I respect your commitment to her. But remember, Eleanor, if she truly has the talent you believe she does, she'll make her own way, with or without Oxford." Eleanor nodded, acknowledging the truth in his words. But it didn't stop her from glancing at her watch, calculating how far Sophie might have progressed through the examination, wondering if she was managing her time properly, if the pressure was interfering with her natural abilities. The 3 hours of the assessment stretched endlessly. Eleanor attempted to grade papers, to review research proposals, to accomplish any of the dozen tasks that usually filled her days. But her mind kept returning to that small examination room, to the young woman fighting for a chance at the education that should have been hers years ago. Finally, precisely 3 hours after it had begun, the examination ended. Eleanor was waiting in the corridor when Sophie emerged, face pale, expression unreadable. "How did it go?" Eleanor asked, searching her features for clues. Sophie exhaled slowly. "I don't know," she admitted. "Some parts felt good, others—" She shook her head. "I ran out of time on the last section, and there was a topology question I couldn't quite." Her voice trailed off, doubt clouding her features. Eleanor placed a reassuring hand on her arm. "You did your best," she said firmly. "That's all anyone could ask. Now we wait." The waiting would be brief, at least. The committee had agreed to expedite their review, given the unusual circumstances and the start of term already underway. They would have an answer by tomorrow afternoon. "Go home," Eleanor urged gently. "Get some rest. You've earned it." Sophie nodded, exhaustion evident in the slump of her shoulders. "Thank you," she said, "for everything. Whatever happens tomorrow, I'm grateful for these past weeks, for being seen." Eleanor watched her walk away, a mix of emotions churning in her chest, hope, anxiety, and a fierce protective instinct she hadn't expected to feel so strongly. Whatever happened tomorrow, she knew one thing with absolute certainty. Sophie Reeves deserved better than the world had given her so far, and perhaps, just perhaps, Oxford would be part of changing that story. The next day dawned with leaden skies hanging over Oxford's ancient spires. Rain fell in a steady, relentless pattern, drumming against windows and slicking the cobblestones. Students hurried between buildings with hunched shoulders and dripping umbrellas, while tour guides shepherded bedraggled visitors through the colleges with forced cheer. Eleanor Walsh barely noticed the weather. Her office window could have looked out on a blizzard or a heat wave, and she would have registered it equally little. Her attention was fixed entirely on the clock above her door, watching as the minute hand crept with excruciating slowness toward 2 o'clock, the hour when the exceptions committee would deliver their verdict on Sophie Reeves. She hadn't seen Sophie since the examination yesterday. The young woman had gone straight to the hospital afterward to be with her father during a treatment session, and then to her night shift at the university. Eleanor had offered to meet her this morning, but Sophie had declined, saying she needed to help her brother with a school project. The unspoken truth hung between them. Sophie couldn't bear to wait with Eleanor, to watch hope turn to disappointment on her mentor's face if the news was bad. Eleanor understood, but still, she wished Sophie were here now. The waiting was unbearable. At precisely 1:58, a knock sounded at her door. Eleanor's heart leapt to her throat. "Come in," she called, struggling to keep her voice steady. Richard Harlow entered, his expression carefully neutral. Behind him followed two other members of the Exceptions Committee, Professor Diana Chen from Pure Mathematics and Dr. James Blackwood, the faculty's admissions coordinator. Their presence was unusual. Typically, Richard would have delivered the committee's decision alone. Eleanor rose from her desk, hands clasped tightly to prevent them from trembling. "Richard," she said, "Professor Chen, Dr. Blackwood." Richard nodded in greeting. "Eleanor, thank you for making time for us on short notice." It was a formality. They all knew she had been waiting for this moment since dawn. Eleanor gestured to the chairs arranged before her desk. "Please, sit." They settled into their seats, arranging papers, adjusting spectacles, small, delaying actions that made Eleanor want to scream with impatience. Finally, Richard cleared his throat. "We've reviewed Ms. Reeves' examination results," he began, "along with the samples of her independent work that you submitted and the rather unconventional application materials." Eleanor nodded, not trusting herself to speak. "Her performance on the examination was..." Richard paused, glancing at his colleagues. Professor Chen spoke up, her voice crisp and direct. "Remarkable, particularly given the circumstances of her preparation." Eleanor felt a flicker of hope. "There were gaps, of course," Dr. Blackwood added, his tone more cautious. "Areas where her lack of formal education was evident. The topology section, in particular, showed some fundamental misunderstandings. But her approach to the differential equations was nothing short of brilliant," Professor Chen countered. "She derived an elegant solution that most of our third years wouldn't have seen." Richard held up a hand to quiet his colleagues. "What we're trying to convey, Eleanor, is that the committee was divided. Ms. Reeves's results were inconsistent, flashes of extraordinary insight alongside gaps in basic knowledge." Eleanor's heart sank. "And your decision?" Richard exchanged another glance with his colleagues, then turned back to her, his expression softening slightly. "We're prepared to offer Ms. Reeves a conditional place in the mathematics program." Eleanor stared at him, hardly daring to believe what she'd heard. "Conditional?" Richard nodded. "She'll need to complete a foundation course first, one term of intensive study to address those gaps in her knowledge. If she passes that successfully, she can matriculate as a full student in January." "With a full scholarship," Professor Du Chen added. "The department has agreed to allocate funds from the Diversity in Mathematics Initiative." Eleanor sank back in her chair, relief washing over her. That's wonderful news." "There's more," Dr. Blackwood said, leaning forward. "Given her family circumstances, we've arranged for flexible attendance. She can continue her night shifts if necessary, with tutorials scheduled around her work commitments." Eleanor looked at each of them in turn, momentarily speechless. It was more than she had dared hope for, not just admission, but genuine accommodation of Sophie's unique situation. "Thank you," she said finally. "This opportunity will change her life." "It may change ours as well," Professor Chen remarked, a hint of a smile playing around her lips. That approach to Navier-Stokes that she sketched in the margins of her examination paper, I've never seen anything quite like it. I'd be very interested in exploring it further with her. Richard gathered his papers, rising from his chair. "The formal offer letter will be sent this afternoon. Ms. Reeves will have 1 week to accept." He paused, his expression growing serious. "I should note, Eleanor, that there was significant resistance to this decision from some quarters. Not everyone on the committee was convinced that bending our policy so extensively was appropriate. "But you were," Eleanor observed. Richard shrugged slightly. "Let's say I was persuaded that rigid adherence to tradition sometimes comes at too high a cost." He glanced at his watch. "I have a faculty meeting in 10 minutes. Will you inform Ms. Reeves of the decision?" Eleanor nodded. "Yes, I'll call her immediately." After they had left, Eleanor sat motionless at her desk, allowing the news to settle around her like a physical presence. Sophie had done it. She had proven herself not just to Eleanor, but to some of the most demanding academics at Oxford. Against all odds, doors that had seemed permanently closed were now opening. With slightly trembling fingers, Eleanor reached for her phone and dialed the number Sophie had given her. It rang several times before going to voicemail. Of course, Sophie would be at the hospital with her father. Eleanor left a brief message asking Sophie to call her as soon as possible, careful not to reveal the committee's decision. This was news that should be delivered in person, not left as a voicemail. The hours crept by. Eleanor tried to focus on other work, lectures to prepare, papers to review, but her mind kept returning to Sophie. How would she react to the news? Would she accept the offer? Could she balance her family, responsibilities with the demands of Oxford's academic program, even with the accommodations the committee had granted? By 6 o'clock, Eleanor had still heard nothing from Sophie. Concern began to gnaw at her. It wasn't like Sophie not to respond to messages even when she was busy. Something must be wrong. Eleanor gathered her things and left the office. Decision made. She would go to the hospital. Sophie had mentioned her father was having treatment today. Perhaps she was still there. Phone turned off in the medical facility. The rain had stopped, but the evening air was heavy with moisture as Eleanor made her way to her car. The city hospital was only a 15-minute drive from the university, a modern glass and steel structure that stood in stark contrast to Oxford's medieval architecture. The main reception area was busy with visitors arriving for evening hours. Eleanor approached the information desk, suddenly realizing she didn't know Sophie's father's full name. "I'm looking for a patient," she began awkwardly. "His daughter is Sophie Reeves. I believe he's receiving cancer treatment." The receptionist tapped at her computer. "Reeves? Yes, Thomas Reeves. Oncology, 4th floor." She glanced up. "Are you family?" "No," Eleanor admitted. "I'm Sophie's professor. I've been trying to reach her about something important." The receptionist hesitated, then seemed to make a decision. "4th floor, West Wing, room 412. She lowered her voice slightly. "You should know, he was moved to intensive care this morning. Family only, technically, but..." She glanced around, then pointed to the elevator. "Go ahead." Eleanor thanked her, a sense of foreboding growing as she rode the elevator to the 4th floor. This explained why Sophie hadn't returned her call. If Thomas Reeves had been moved to intensive care, something serious must have happened. A complication, perhaps, or an adverse reaction to treatment. The oncology ward was quieter than the main reception area, hushed voices and gentle beeping of machinery creating a subdued atmosphere. Eleanor followed the signs to room 412, her footsteps slowing as she approached. The door was partially open. Through the gap, Eleanor could see Sophie sitting beside a hospital bed, her back to the door. She was holding the hand of a thin man whose gaunt face bore a striking resemblance to hers. The same sharp cheekbones, the same determined set of the jaw, even in illness. Eleanor hesitated, suddenly uncertain. This was a private moment, a family crisis. Her news about Oxford, however positive, seemed trivial in comparison to whatever Sophie was facing in that room. As she stood there, torn between entering and retreating, a young boy emerged from the room, 12 or 13, with Sophie's dark hair and serious eyes. He stopped when he saw Eleanor, regarding her with wary curiosity. "Are you looking for Sophie?" he asked. Eleanor nodded. "Yes, I'm Dr. Walsh, her professor." It wasn't quite accurate, not yet, but it seemed simpler than explaining the whole situation. The boy's face brightened with recognition. "She talks about you. You're helping her get into Oxford." He extended his hand with surprising formality. "I'm Jamie, Sophie's brother." Eleanor shook his hand, struck by the maturity in his young face. "It's nice to meet you, Jamie. I don't want to intrude if this isn't a good time." Jamie glanced back at the room, his expression sobering. "Dad had a bad reaction to his treatment this morning. They're saying it's pneumonia, but..." He shrugged, the gesture too old for his years. "Sophie's been here all day. She could probably use a break, actually." Before Eleanor could respond, Jamie had turned and re-entered the room. She heard him speaking softly to his sister. Then Sophie appeared in the doorway, surprise evident on her tired face. "Dr. Walsh," she said, "what are you doing here?" Eleanor's carefully prepared speech about the committee's decision evaporated. All she could see was the exhaustion in Sophie's eyes, the strain in her posture. "I've been trying to reach you," she said simply. "When I couldn't, I got worried. Jamie just told me about your father. I'm so sorry, Sophie." Sophie ran a hand through her hair, which had escaped its usual neat ponytail. "It happened suddenly. His immune system is compromised from the chemo, and the infection just..." She took a breath, visibly gathering herself. "The doctors are cautiously optimistic. The antibiotics seem to be working." Eleanor nodded, relieved. "That's good news." "Yeah." Sophie glanced back at the room, then stepped fully into the hallway, closing the door partway behind her. "Jamie said you've been trying to reach me all day. Is it about the assessment?" Eleanor hesitated. This wasn't how she had imagined sharing the news in a hospital corridor, with Sophie's mind naturally elsewhere. But perhaps she realized Sophie needed this bit of hope now more than ever. "Yes," she said. "The committee met this morning. They've offered you a place, Sophie. A conditional offer with a full scholarship." Sophie stared at her, color draining from her already pale face. "They... what?" "You've been accepted," Eleanor repeated gently. "There are conditions, a foundation term to address some gaps in your formal knowledge, but after that, a full place in the mathematics program with accommodations for your work schedule and family commitments." Sophie reached out blindly, her hand finding the wall for support. "I thought, after the exam, I was sure I'd failed." "Far from it. Professor Chen was particularly impressed with your approach to differential equations. She wants to work with you directly during your foundation term." Sophie shook her head slowly, as if trying to make the news fit into a world that had been dominated by crisis since dawn. "I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything right now," Eleanor assured her. "The formal offer will come by mail in the next day or two. You'll have a week to decide." "Decide," Sophie repeated dully. She glanced toward the hospital room, where her father lay fighting an infection that might have gone differently had. They had better insurance, better resources, better options. As if there's a choice to make. Eleanor stepped closer, keeping her voice low. "Sophie, listen to me. I understand this comes at a difficult moment. Your father's health has to be your priority right now, but this opportunity, it doesn't have to be either or. The committee has already agreed to flexible arrangements. We can work with you to make this possible." Sophie didn't respond, her gaze still fixed on the partially open door to her father's room. Inside, Jamie sat beside the bed, small hand resting on his father's arm, looking far too young for the burden he carried. Finally, Sophie turned back to Eleanor, her expression a complex mixture of gratitude, exhaustion, and a spark of that fierce determination that had drawn Eleanor to her in the first place. "I need to think," she said, "about all of it, but thank you, Dr. Walsh, for everything." Eleanor understood she was being dismissed, gently but firmly. Sophie needed to be with her family now, needed space to process everything that had happened today. "Of course," she said. "Call me when you're ready to talk more, or if you need anything at all." Sophie nodded, already turning back toward the hospital room, toward responsibilities that had defined her life for so long. As Eleanor walked back to the elevator, she felt a strange mixture of emotions. Joy for Sophie's acceptance, concern for her father's health, and a growing awareness that the story she had thought she was part of, brilliant outsider recognized at last, doors finally opening, was far more complicated in reality. For Sophie, Oxford wasn't just an opportunity. It was a life-altering choice, one that came with its own set of challenges and sacrifices. The question wasn't just whether Sophie could succeed at Oxford, Eleanor had no doubts about that, but whether Oxford could bend enough to accommodate the full, complex reality of her life. The following 3 days passed without word from Sophie. Eleanor respected her need for space, focusing instead on practical preparations. She gathered textbooks for the foundation course, discussed tutorial schedules with colleagues, and quietly researched resources that might help with Thomas Reeves's medical care. On the 4th day, just as Eleanor was preparing to leave her office for an evening seminar, her phone rang. Sophie's name appeared on the screen. "Sophie," Eleanor answered quickly. "How are you? How's your father?" "Better," Sophie replied, her voice tired but steady. "The infection's under control. They're talking about sending him home tomorrow with home healthcare visits." "That's wonderful news." "Yes," Sophie agreed. There was a pause. Then, "I was wondering if we could meet to discuss the offer." Eleanor felt a surge of hope. "Of course. When would be convenient for you?" "Tonight, after my shift, around midnight?" It was late, but Eleanor didn't hesitate. "That's fine. My office." "Actually," Sophie said, "could we meet somewhere else? The cafeteria, maybe?" Eleanor understood immediately. Sophie wanted to meet on her own territory in the place where Eleanor had first discovered her work. "The cafeteria it is," she agreed. "I'll see you at midnight." The university was a different place at night. Corridors that bustled with students during the day lay silent and shadowed. Libraries that buzzed with academic energy stood quiet, books closed and computers sleeping. Even the air felt different, still, expectant, as if the ancient buildings were holding their breath. Eleanor made her way through the deserted campus, her footsteps echoing on stone pathways. The cafeteria building loomed ahead, most of its windows dark except for the security lights and a familiar glow from the far corner where she had first noticed Sophie working on her equations. Inside, the cafeteria was empty, chairs stacked. On tables, floors gleaming from recent cleaning. Sophie sat in the same spot where Eleanor had discovered her all those weeks ago, but tonight she wasn't hunched over napkins covered in equations. Tonight, she sat straight-backed, hands folded neatly on the table, an envelope bearing the Oxford crest placed precisely before her. She looked up as Eleanor approached, offering a small smile. "Professor." "Sophie." Eleanor took the seat. Across from her, noting the changes in the young woman's appearance. She seemed thinner, if that was possible, with deeper shadows under her eyes. But there was also something else, a clarity, a focus, as if she had come through a storm into unexpected calm. Sophie tapped the envelope. "It came yesterday." "And have you decided?" Eleanor asked, trying to keep her voice neutral. Sophie was quiet for a moment, gathering her thoughts. When she spoke, her words were careful, measured. "When I was 16, she began, my math teacher took me aside after class. She told me I had a gift, that I should apply for scholarships, that I could go anywhere." Sophie's lips curved in a humorless smile. "I believed her. I worked harder than I'd ever worked in my life. I applied for every scholarship I could find, and I got one. A full ride to King's College London." She paused, eyes distant with memory. "The day the acceptance letter came, my dad took us out to dinner to celebrate. First time we'd eaten at a restaurant in years. He was so proud. That night, when I got home, I made a list of all the things I'd study, all the discoveries I might make one day." Her expression darkened. 2 weeks later, he collapsed at work. Stage 3 pancreatic cancer. And just like that, my careful plans, my scholarships, my dreams, they all became secondary. Eleanor listened silently, understanding that Sophie needed to tell this story, to articulate the path that had led her to this moment. "For the last 5 years," Sophie continued, "I've lived my life in practical terms. What pays the bills? What keeps my family safe? What can I sacrifice to make sure Jamie gets to stay in school? Mathematics became my secret, my escape, something I did in stolen moments when no one was watching." She looked down at the Oxford envelope, her fingers tracing the embossed crest. "And now this, a door opening that I never thought would open again." "Are you going to walk through it?" Eleanor asked softly. Sophie met her gaze directly. "Yes," she said, "but not the way the committee expects." Eleanor frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" Sophie reached into her bag and pulled out a folder, not the formal Oxford folder Eleanor had given her, but a simple, worn cardboard one. She opened it, revealing several sheets of paper covered in neat handwriting. "I've drafted a counter-proposal," she explained. "The committee's offer is generous, but it's built on assumptions that don't match my reality." Eleanor's frown deepened. "What kind of counter-proposal?" "A different pathway," Sophie said. "I can't commit to the foundation term as they've outlined it, not with Dad's condition still unstable and Jamie needing someone at home. But I can commit to a modified version." She slid the papers across the table. Eleanor scanned them quickly, eyes widening as she absorbed Sophie's detailed plan. It was innovative, practical, and remarkably bold. A blend of in-person tutorials, independent study, and remote learning that would allow Sophie to continue supporting her family while gradually transitioning into full-time education. "This is ambitious," Eleanor said finally. "You're essentially asking the university to create a custom program for you." "Yes," Sophie agreed without apology. "Because the standard program won't work for me, and I suspect it doesn't work for many others like me either." Eleanor continued reading, noting the careful scheduling, the contingency plans for medical emergencies, the detailed outline of how Sophie would demonstrate her progress. It was meticulously thought out, a testament to both her intelligence and her practical experience in navigating complex responsibilities. "The committee may resist," Eleanor warned. "They've already made significant exceptions." Sophie nodded, accepting this reality. "I understand, but this is the only way I can accept their offer. My family isn't an obligation I can set aside or work around. They're the reason I'm doing this in the first place." Eleanor looked up from the papers, studying Sophie's face. There was determination there, but also vulnerability. The fear of rejection, of having a door close just as it had begun to open. "What if they say no?" Eleanor asked gently. Sophie straightened her shoulders, a gesture Eleanor had come to recognize as her way of facing difficult truths. "Then I'll continue as I have been. Working nights, studying when I can, doing mathematics, on napkins and scraps of paper. And maybe someday, when Jamie's older and Dad is stable, I'll try again." There was no self-pity in her voice, just a clear-eyed assessment of her options. Eleanor felt a surge of admiration mixed with a peculiar kind of grief. Grief for all the Sophie Reeveses in the world. Brilliant minds constrained by circumstances beyond their control. Their potential glimpsed only in fragments and flashes. "I'll present your proposal to the committee," Eleanor said, gathering the papers, "and I'll advocate for it strongly." "Thank you," Sophie said simply. Eleanor hesitated, then asked the question that had been lingering in her mind. "Have you told your father about the offer?" A genuine smile crossed Sophie's face, the first Eleanor had seen in days. "Yes, last night, when he was feeling stronger. He cried." Her voice softened with the memory. "He said he always knew I was meant for better things than cleaning floors." "He was right," Eleanor said quietly. Sophie shook her head slightly. "There's nothing wrong with cleaning floors, Professor. Honest work that supports your family. There's dignity in that. I just want the chance to do both, to support my family and to contribute to mathematics in a meaningful way." Eleanor nodded, chastened by the gentle correction. "Of course, I misspoke." They sat in companionable silence for a moment, the empty cafeteria quiet around them. Then Sophie glanced at her watch. "I should go. Jamie's alone with Dad and he has school tomorrow." Eleanor gathered her things, tucking Sophie's counter-proposal carefully into her bag. "I'll take this to the committee first thing tomorrow. How can I reach you once they've made their decision?" "I'll be on shift here tomorrow night," Sophie said. "Or you can leave a message with facilities management." They walked together to the exit, the night air cool and crisp as they stepped. Outside, the Oxford campus spread before them, ancient buildings silhouetted against the starlit sky. For centuries, those buildings had stood as symbols of knowledge and exclusion, of opportunity and privilege. Tonight, they seemed to watch in silent judgment, waiting to see if their venerable traditions could bend to accommodate a new kind of student. "Whatever the committee decides," Eleanor said as they prepared to part ways, "you've already accomplished something remarkable, Sophie. You forced an institution that prides itself on tradition to reconsider what education can look like, who it can serve." Sophie smiled faintly. "I just want to do mathematics, Professor. Changing institutions is your department." With that, she turned and walked away, a solitary figure moving through pools of lamplight, head held high, despite the weight of responsibilities Eleanor could only begin to imagine. Watching her go, Eleanor felt a fierce determination rising within her. Sophie Reeves would have her chance, not as a charity case, not as an exception to be accommodated, but as a mathematician whose unique perspective and resilience were assets, to be valued, whose brilliance deserved nurturing, regardless of the unconventional path it had taken. Oxford might resist change. Traditions might prove difficult to reshape. But Eleanor Walsh was prepared to fight those battles, one committee meeting at a time, because sometimes the most important revolutions began not with grand pronouncements, but with equations scribbled on cafeteria napkins in the quiet hours of the night. Snow dusted Oxford's ancient spires like powdered sugar on a wedding cake. 3 months had passed since Sophie Reeves had submitted her counter-proposal to the admissions committee. 3 months of negotiations, adjustments, and carefully crafted compromises. Winter had transformed the campus into a postcard scene. Students bundled in scarves and coats, hurrying between buildings, their breath fogging in the crisp air. Finals week approached, bringing with it the peculiar tension that always settled over the university at this time of year. In her office, Eleanor Walsh sat reviewing a set of papers, red pen in hand. But these weren't ordinary student assignments. These were Sophie's latest submissions, complex analyses of partial differential equations that would challenge most graduate students, let alone someone in a foundational course. A knock at the door interrupted her concentration. "Come in," she called, setting down her pen. Professor Richard Harlow entered, stomping snow from his boots. Miserable weather, he complained, unwinding his scarf. The committee meeting's been moved to Sanders Hall. Heating's out in the usual room. Eleanor gathered her files. I was just finishing my review of Sophie's most recent work. It's extraordinary, Richard. Her approach to the Hodge conjecture. Yes, yes, Richard interrupted, though not unkindly. Save it for the committee. Chen's already singing her praises to anyone who'll listen. Did you know Sophie's been corresponding with Yamamoto at Tokyo University about his recent paper? Eleanor smiled. I did. He contacted me last week asking if she was really just a foundation student. They walked together across the snowy quad, shoes crunching on the freshly fallen powder. Richard was silent for a moment, then said quietly, "You know, when you first brought her case to us, I thought it was, well, a charitable impulse. A bright girl from difficult circumstances, yes, but not truly exceptional." Eleanor raised an eyebrow. And now? Richard shook his head, something like wonder in his expression. I was wrong. It happens rarely, but I admit it freely in this case. What she's accomplished in these 3 months, working under conditions that would crush most students. He trailed off. The experiment is working, Eleanor. Better than any of us anticipated. The experiment, as Richard called it, was Sophie's custom educational pathway. After intense debate, the committee had approved a modified version of her proposal, a hybrid program that allowed her to attend some lectures in person, complete other coursework remotely, and demonstrate her progress through regular assessments rather than traditional examinations. It hadn't been easy. There had been resistance from traditionalists, concerns about precedent, worries that accommodations would lower standards. But Sophie had met every challenge with quiet determination, producing work of such quality that even the most skeptical committee members had been forced to reconsider their positions. They reached Sanders Hall and entered the warm building, shaking off the cold. The committee room was already filled with faculty members, conversation flowing as they arranged papers and poured coffee from the sideboard. Eleanor took her seat, aware of the significance of today's meeting. This was Sophie's formal review, the assessment that would determine whether she could progress from her foundation term to full student status next month. Professor Chen approached, excitement evident in her quick movements. Have you seen Sophie's latest submission, her new proof approach for the Riemann hypothesis? Eleanor nodded. I reviewed it last night. It's promising. Promising? Chen laughed. It's revolutionary. If she can complete it, and I believe she can, it could be published in any journal in the field. Their conversation was cut short as the committee chair called the meeting to order. For the next hour, faculty members presented their assessments of Sophie's work, analyzing her progress, debating her strengths and remaining weaknesses, considering her readiness to join the regular student cohort. The consensus was clear, if unprecedented. Sophie Reeves had not merely met the requirements of her foundation term, she had exceeded them, producing work that would be exceptional from a student at any level. There is one remaining question, the chair said as the presentation phase concluded. The arrangement we approved was temporary, a trial to see if this unconventional approach could work. Now we must decide, do we extend it? Do we create a permanent framework for students like Ms. Reeves, or do we consider this a one-time exception? The room fell silent, members exchanging glances, weighing implications. This was about more than one brilliant student now. It was about what Oxford might become, about opening doors that had remained closed for centuries. Eleanor cleared her throat. If I may, she began, I believe this question extends beyond our committee. It's about the future of education itself. For too long, we've defined academic excellence narrowly, not just in terms of ability, but in terms of circumstance. We've excluded brilliant minds, not because they lacked capacity, but because they lacked privilege. She looked around the room, meeting each colleague's gaze directly. Sophie Reeves is exceptional, yes, but she is not unique. There are others out there, cleaning floors, serving food, caring for family members, whose minds could transform mathematics, physics, literature if only we created paths for them to reach us. Richard Harlow spoke next, his deliberate tone carrying weight. Creating a permanent pathway would require significant resources, administrative support, faculty willing to adapt. It's not a simple undertaking. Few worthwhile things are, Eleanor countered. The debate continued, passionate but respectful. By meeting's end, a tentative consensus had formed. The committee would recommend establishing a pilot program, 5 places per year for students with exceptional ability whose circumstances required non-traditional educational approaches. It was a small step, perhaps, but in an institution as ancient and tradition-bound as Oxford, even small steps could signal profound change. As the meeting adjourned, Richard approached Eleanor. "Well fought," he said, "though I suspect the real battles are still ahead. The Faculty Senate, the Chancellor, the Board of Governors." Eleanor smiled tiredly. "One meeting at a time, Richard. And Sophie, will you tell her the news?" Eleanor gathered her papers. "Not yet. Her father's health has improved, but he's still fragile. She's with him today. The doctors are discussing a new treatment regimen." Richard nodded. "Let me know when you do tell her. I'd like to be there, to apologize for my initial skepticism, if nothing else." Outside, the snow had stopped falling, leaving the campus blanketed in pristine white. Eleanor walked slowly through, the quiet quadrangles, mind drifting back to that late night months ago when a stubborn light had caught her attention. How easily she might have walked past. How many others had walked past without seeing. The thought sobered her, reminded her how precarious discovery could be, how dependent on chance and choice and the willingness to look beyond the expected. That evening, Eleanor returned to the cafeteria. It was busy now, students grabbing quick meals before returning to their studies. She found a quiet corner and sent a text to Sophie. "Good news from the committee. Let me know when you're free to talk." An hour later, Sophie appeared, cheeks flushed from the cold, snowflakes melting in her dark hair. She looked different now, still, serious, still bearing responsibilities beyond her years, but with a new confidence in her posture, a certainty that hadn't been there before. "Professor?" she greeted Eleanor, unwinding her scarf. "Sorry I couldn't come sooner. Dad's appointment ran late." "How is he?" Eleanor asked. A smile brightened Sophie's face. "Better. The new medication is working. The doctor thinks he might be a candidate for a clinical trial at the university hospital." "That's wonderful news." Sophie nodded, then leaned forward slightly. "Your text said there was news from the committee?" "Yes," Eleanor confirmed. "You've been approved to progress to full student status next term, with continuation of your current arrangements." Sophie exhaled slowly, relief and pride mingling in her expression. "Thank you for everything." "You earned this, Sophie. Every step of the way." "No." Sophie shook her head firmly. "I worked hard, yes, but without you, without someone willing to notice, to take a chance, none of this would have happened." She paused, then added quietly, "Do you know what the hardest part was? Not the work, not even managing time between study and family and my job. It was believing I had the right to be here, that I belonged." Eleanor's throat tightened with emotion. "You belong here as much as anyone ever has." Sophie glanced around. The cafeteria, her gaze resting briefly on the corner table where Eleanor had first discovered her working on napkins. "There's something else I wanted to tell you," she said. "I've been offered a position. Research assistant in the mathematics department. 20 hours a week, flexible schedule, better pay than cleaning, and relevant experience for my CV." "That's wonderful," Eleanor exclaimed. "Professor Chen mentioned she was impressed with your correspondence with Yamamoto." It was her recommendation that secured the position, Sophie acknowledged. Then, with a hint of mischief in her eyes, she added, "Though I'll probably still clean the occasional table. Old habits." They both laughed, the sound bright in the busy cafeteria. Around them, students hunched over laptops, argued over theories, worried about exams, ordinary concerns that had once seemed impossibly distant for Sophie. As they parted ways, Eleanor watched Sophie walk through the crowded space, moving with the quiet confidence of someone who had found their place in the world. Not through luck or privilege, or even extraordinary talent alone, but through persistence, through courage, through refusing to let circumstances define possibility. In the grand story of Oxford, Sophie Reeves would be a small chapter, one student, among thousands who had passed through its ancient halls. But perhaps her footsteps would clear a path that others might follow, proving that brilliance could be found in unexpected corners, that equations scratched on cafeteria napkins might contain the seeds of revolution. And perhaps the most important lesson wasn't about mathematics at all, but about seeing, truly seeing, the potential that surrounds us, waiting only for someone to notice, to say, "This light matters, this mind matters, this person belongs." Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.